Okay, great. Firstly, congratulations to both teams for making the partial quarterfinals of this tournament. I'm Alexandra. I'll be your chair for this round. I'll invite my panelists to introduce themselves as well.
Hello, I'm Umesh. No preferred pronouns, but I recommend everyone to refer to the panel as a whole. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Pranav.
Okay, cool. And so I think the Gov and Op teams, you can introduce yourself and your preferred pronouns as well.
Cool. I'm Emmanuel. Pronouns are he, him. I'll be the PM.
I'm Alex. My pronouns are he, him, and I'll be the MG.
Op.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My pronouns are she, her. I will be LOing.
And I'm Daniel. My pronouns are he, him, and I will be the MO.
Okay, cool. Then without further ado, on the motion, this House supports courts piercing the corporate veil when plaintiffs allege a company has violated environmental regulations. I invite PM whenever you're ready.
Sweet. Let me get up my timer 1 second. Okay, now it actually is time for pleasantries. Alex, thank you very much for debating with me. The overall reason it's cool to debate with you is that we think similarly enough to be on the same page, but then differently enough that I feel like I'm learning from you each round. And also because I've wanted to debate with William married people, and I think you're one of the cooler ones. So very happy to be debating with you. And then to the panel, thanks for judging, and to Op. There are a lot of Chicago people running around, so I'm glad that we continue the precedent of hitting one another. I think it's going to be a fun round. Is anyone not ready? Great. 2 points of framing. The first is that when you sue this individual and you pierce the veil, the punishment is going to be commensurate to the degree of damage they did. This is true of literally every other kind of lawsuit. Second, we're going to say that if there are other grounds that you could also sue a person on, it is likely that that suit still happens. That is because if you have an incentive to win in a court case, you would try all of the vectors of winning. And if you weren't trying to win, you probably wouldn't be trying the case in the first place. Finally, I want to just characterize briefly the kinds of people who are suing. I think it's environmental watchdogs because they're actually able to detect the fact that you've done an infringement on the law. Second, I think it's the bureaucrats who are enforcing the regulations. They have an incentive already to make the policies they pass actually be enforced. Third, I think that it's likely to be any individual who wants money, right? You're suing and you're going to get something out of it. Or four, it could even be other corporations who are aware of the fact that you've broken the law. And so they have an incentive actually to point out that you have done something criminal and specifically get rid of you. And it might be easier for them to do so because the cost of suing might be lower. They actually might be incentivized to reduce their own environmental sins in order to be able to sue other individuals. I think that one is probably the least likely, but it will happen in some scenarios. That said, a couple of arguments. The general trend of our case, by the way, is just going to be this is effective, done well, and creates deterrence, which means that you can protect the environment, which is important because there are a large number of individuals who cannot consent into those environmental damages. So when the river is poisoned, it means that someone 200 miles away isn't able to drink clean drinking water. That person didn't consent, and we think that there are obligations for the courts to protect these people as well. That's because the court is responsible for protecting society and establishing moral minimums and precedents that help society overall. If society in general was harmed through environmental protections, there's also an obligation for the justice system to remedy those harms and to put them on trial. So, couple arguments. The first is why is suing the reason that suing an individual is incredibly good, or even a collection of powerful individuals. A couple of reasons for this. Firstly, we think that when a person is kicked out of their powerful position, the replacement is likely to make promises they will fix the situation. They will stop the infringements on the environmental regulation. And they have to do this because they were literally chosen as the successor on the basis of solving this issue. Secondly, I think that in the status quo, companies know that they can just settle when they're sued as a corporation. because they choose the instances in which they violate the environmental protection and then weigh the profitability opportunities of making that decision and then weight that by the probability of being chosen in the first place. And so therefore they can literally use math to figure out how, if this decision makes sense financially for them, and therefore they're not deterred by the thought of penalties. Third, I think that there's less direct harm to the perpetrator in the status quo. When I know individually my assets could be stolen or I could be thrown in prison, for example, if that's like the way what the court says, that it has to be so severe, you have to be thrown in prison, I think I directly am harmed as the perpetrator, and therefore I'm less likely to perpetuate, as opposed to the alternative. I know that, as long as I keep getting the corporate bonus, in worst case, the corporation can't give me a bonus next year because they're the ones who are going to have to fit the bill. I also think that when you sue, you're most likely to sue the people who are most powerful in the corporation. That is because if you were suing on the basis of responsibility, the person who was responsible also had the most ability to change the situation in the first place. I think those people tend to be individuals who are very publicly visible. That is, the powerful person in a corporation is like the CEO, for example. They're incredibly well known. And therefore, I think that punishing this person is also likely to have a lot of signaling effects to other CEOs. It's something that's going to have scandal, et cetera. People are going to know about it. Second claim is that those who are most responsible and those who are individuals could actually have remedied these environmental degradations. They could have fixed the situation in a couple of ways. Firstly, I think that the worst environmental damages happen at a tremendous scale in terms of you doing something, so like literally breaking the law, right? So this isn't like an oil spill, for example, where something accidentally happened. It's an oil spill where you structurally didn't invest in countermeasures, for example, protecting the oil rig. And you know that kind of person who can make a decision about how to have like an efficient and like modern oil rig? It's the CEO who's funding the oil rig in the first place. Second, I think that these individuals could hire auditors, for example, to go around and just have a well-managed approach to ensure that there aren't minor infringements on regulations or even large ones. Third, I think that corporations and leaders can choose which kinds of investments they do in order to prioritize green technology, right? So you begin to invest in like the solar panels, for example, and things like that, because you want to ensure that the kinds of business you're engaging in are also the kinds of businesses that are least likely to result in a lawsuit against you. I also think that you can change the corporate culture. The kinds of people you promote then project what images of success are and hire people below them who have similar models and beliefs and perspectives. And so this changes the culture down to the lowest rungs. I also think that any person who was replaced for breaking these laws is replaced by someone else. So you're also cycling through bad individuals by just getting rid of them more quickly. The third argument under a third claim is how we get deterrence. Firstly, when a corporation does not know if they will be sued on Gov's basis or the only basis that OP is able to defend, they have to protect themselves from both kinds of lawsuits, which is net more expensive for them and makes an opportunity cost such that it is cheaper for them, for example, to hedge against but not break the law in the first place. So they have to prepare for a settlement, for example, but then the CEO also has to like put money aside or whatever, like in case he's going to be sued, or at least what we can do is for environmental groups, for example, to choose the lawsuit they do that is most likely to be effective, right? Like they will know the op arguments and they will be able to say like, in this instance, we're more likely to succeed by suing the individual, so we're going to do it in this instance. Third, I think that suing the board or suing a powerful leader still affects the optics of the business, right? So if his CEO is about to get laid off, for example, it creates a lot of uncertainty about the future trajectory of the business, and it also affects, therefore, the shareholders' incentives, for example. And even if that's not the case, the reason the CEO currently in power is because they have good relationships with the shareholders and the shareholders have faith in them. The counterfactual person might not have that. Third, I think that you can be sued simultaneously under both standards to the extent that there are two pots of money that you can earn as a result of this lawsuit, or two kinds of precedents you can establish at the same time. That is a precedent for how individuals are prosecuted as well as how the company would be. I think you are likely to do both if you're an individual who cares about protecting the environment. Finally, I think that all of these lawsuits are likely to be evaluated well for a couple of reasons, or be done well. Firstly, I think frivolous lawsuits are unlikely to happen because if you're doing a frivolous lawsuit, it would be against like a smaller corporation that doesn't actually give you a shit ton, and it like there's not a huge benefit of just some random person being in jail. So if you're trying against a big corporation, it's unlikely to be frivolous because they could just win the case. Second, I think that even if there are certain frivolous cases, I think in general we trust the justice system to evaluate on the basis of justice, right, and the thing that is right, and also to be able to evaluate if something is frivolous and then to reject it in those cases. For all these reasons, we propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. Ella, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I'll take a moment to do pleasantries as well. Hello, everyone. Thank you, judges. Thank you, Drexel, for running a good tournament. Thank you to our opponents. I'm excited. Daniel, thank you for debating with me. Happy I got to steal you from Andrew for a tournament. It's been a pleasure. Order is going to be off on nice and simple. All right. 3, 2, 1. Bit of framing up talk about why they have no solvency on their side. 3 warrants for this. First is that judges get to throw it out. Right now, the judicial system in the US is incredibly conservative leaning. This means that they are less likely to be sympathetic to these sorts of judicial arguments, lawsuits on the basis of environmental protections anyway. This is especially the case with novel judicial theories, because they tend to be originalists as well and are unlikely to want to throw out precedent in order to do this, and they are going to be more opposed in general. Second is that environmental regulations are weak at the federal level. Recognize that Gov is fundamentally limited by the environmental regulations existing in the first place. Why does this matter? Environmental regulations are uniquely bad at the federal level right now after the Trump administration pulled back a lot of the EPA and the Chevron doctrine got nuked in the Supreme Court. This means that environmental regulations federally are bad. Therefore, the majority of these lawsuits are probably happening in states like California and New York that have stronger environmental regulations. Why does any of this matter for this case? It matters because once you include piercing the veil, a novel judicial theory, because as we know from background, piercing the veil in this way is not something that has happened before. This novel theory is more likely to be sent up to a higher court. As Emmanuel himself tells you, it is the case that companies are more likely to settle without piercing the veil. This means money actually is given to the people who need it, and it's not sent up to a higher court. If a company knows that they can be sent up to a higher court with piercing the veil, where it's fully thrown out, that they face no accountability whatsoever, I prefer slightly less money if we have a higher percentage of these cases actually getting ruled in our favor. Third warrant here is just that lawsuits are hard. I don't think they understand how difficult it is to pursue a new judicial theory and lawsuits of these kind. They make a lot of assertions about how the people doing this are likely to do it well, but one thing I think they miss is the resources. It is incredibly expensive to sue a major company, and I think this is especially the case for individuals like environmental watchdogs. Nonprofits tend to be relatively underfunded in comparison to big companies, and certainly environmental bureaucrats like the EPA are. I'll take a moment to do some integrated rebuttal here about the corporations as well, because one, as they acknowledge themselves, the companies are unlikely to want to push back against, but recognize that if we talk about other corporations suing, they are less likely to do that in their side, because they talk about how there is an effective deterrence, because CEOs are scared of being sued. If I'm a CEO of Shell, I'm not going to go sue Exxon, because then I think Exxon will sue me back, and I'm scared of expanding this precedent. So the people doing these lawsuits probably are underfunded. Second, first off-case position then is about solving climate change. They miss that climate change is a systemic issue. It is not effective to hold individuals accountable. While they often do cause harm, the issues, including the ones Emmanuel gave, are more systemic, i.e. it is not one person being like, haha, take away those environmental protections on this oil rig. It is probably a larger system where there's a lack of checks and balances, a lack of keeping safe protocol, and a lack of enforcement. This means it is more effective to target the entire company, because then that provides incentive for the company itself to change. Gut check this for the moment. Even if we scare off one evil CEO of Exxon, another will just take his place, because the company didn't actually lose any credibility. They just throw one person out and cycle through CEOs. In fact, this is preferable for the company, because now they are less likely to get the money themselves. The reason why there is a trade-off here between doing one form of suit and doing the other is because these people doing the lawsuits in the first place do not have the resources to pursue both, which means they are likely just going to pursue the one on their side of the house, because that is the one the courts actively support. This means that the companies prefer it this way because they can just blame their CEOs. Okay, second subpoint here is on deterrence. What do people actually care about? There'll be some integrated rebuttal here. First, on money. The CEO salary is likely to stay high on their side of the house, which means that people are still incented. Why is this? Because the company hasn't lost any of its money. The actual monetary cost falls only on the individual themselves, which means they are likely able to incite another CEO without changing their core practices. But secondly, recognize that in terms of the actual money cost to the company versus to the individual, it is proportionally much higher to the company. The company has a higher proportion of money in the first place, and judges tend to be far more willing to attack a company for a large sum of money as opposed to an individual because the psychological bias is against harming someone. This means that both proportionally and absolutely we're getting more money when suing companies than when suing individuals. This is especially the case if you buy the they can do it both argumentation that Gov provides, because then they do not want the entire sum to be too large. So realistically, you're just splitting it 50-50 and the deterrence is weakened in both cases. The second thing I think that CEOs care about, though, is prestige. Recognize that these people already have a shit ton of money, which means the marginal increase or loss of money here is probably not that important. What do they care about instead? They care about prestige, i.e., they care if they make headlines in all the newspapers being like, so-and-so, like this company was sued for this amount of money. Why does this matter? It matters because of the framing I gave above about going up to higher courts. Settlements, even large settlements in state court, never make as much news as settlements in federal court. This means that if we can keep it in lower courts, we are more likely to actually get settlements and have a deterrence effect. Third is a piece of terminal defense against the arguments about individual accountability, which is scapegoating. It is so easy for people to just be like, this one board member was the problem. The other 6 of us who were all in the room while you're making the decision, we had nothing to do with it. Obviously, this is bullshit. There is no one individual deciding where to put the new oil rig. It is a collective decision. So just holding the CEO accountable doesn't actually check back for any of this. And the CEO might just blame someone lower down than them, which means there's no actual accountability here. Finally, on this point of fixing climate change is the resource trade-off. As I mentioned before, piercing the veil is incredibly expensive, particularly because it requires the hiring of specialist lawyers. Lawyers who we know from background are trained in fraud, not in environmental regulation, which means they are woefully unprepared to help you with this case, meaning that you are not spending your money in as effective a manner as you would. This is critical as your resources are limited. The second off-case position about innovation. People who start businesses take on substantial risk, but they mitigate this risk by sharing it across of investors. Specifically, the risk of running afoul of the environmental regulation is a big issue for companies trying to develop environmental technologies. If you want to start an electric car company, you have to deal with lots of regulations around what types of metals, engine parts, battery waste, and et cetera you can deal with. This is a substantial risk. These laws are always changing, and big car has an incentive to sue you. Recognize from the framing above, because these are expensive lawsuits, we actually only empower the bigger businesses to sue the little ones, i.e. it is easier for Exxon to sue an electric car starter for environmental regulations than it is for the reverse to happen. This means that the climate change impacts actually flow the other way. This is also likely because incidental slip-ups are likely to be perceived as malicious, making this harm all the more apparent. Finally, on precedent. Using piercing the veil in a new way sets a precedent that can be violated in more ways, i.e. the same legal theory that applies to environmental regulations and piercing the veil can also be applied to conservative laws like healthcare providers for companies that also provide care for abortion. Since we set the precedent that piercing the veil can happen in new ways, it is now comparatively easier for other people to go around and sue them. Why do we get a delta here? Because the judiciary and federal laws, as I told you, skew conservative. It is far more likely that if this gets raised to the Supreme Court or a federal district court, that court is going to rule in favor of the one that gets out abortion access, targeting individual people there. This means if you give them their best case and all of these deterrent mechanisms work perfectly, they comparatively work better when doing things like targeting gender-affirming care and abortion access, which I think are things we can all agree are good. Okay, on case proper. I did a lot of this integrated. I talked about the framing already. Okay, now talk about the effective deterrence. A lot of this is directly clashing with on case, but what I want to flag is that none of their warrants about how individuals will act cautiously are actually unique to the individual. If anything, I expect the corporation to be more cautious because they are collectively held responsible when suing the company. 5 minds is more effective than 1 in preventing accidental slip-ups. I talked about why suing the CEO alone is not effective. And then they say you have time to do both types of lawsuits. One thing I think they missed from the wording of motion is the motion talks about courts intervening, allowing the piercing the veil when plaintiffs allege wrongdoing. It just says nothing about what happens once wrongdoing is found, i.e. in our world, we can still pierce the veil after it becomes no longer an allegation but substantiated. Proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. MG, whenever you're ready.
Okay. I'll do some pleasantries. Judges, thank you for judging, and Drexel, thank you for hosting a very fun tournament. Daniel and Sarah, I don't know you guys well. I've debated you, Daniel. You're a great debater. Sarah, I watched you get tight called by Nick at Hopkins. That was funny. Other than that, you guys seem like good debaters, and I'm happy to be debating against you. Emmanuel, you're like my favorite person to debate with. Thank you so much for for debating with me. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and you make the activity very fun. I like have Lyme disease right now, and I'm very sick, so the only reason I agreed to debate is the fun of getting to debate with Emmanuel. Um, yeah, speech will not be very organized. Sorry about that. Hopefully you guys are good at flowing. Is anyone not ready? I will start in three, actually. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I think what is often failed to do by the LOC is considering the counterfactual. Here's intuition pump. Is this actually working at present to prevent companies taking flagrant environmental violations? I think the answer is no. You only sue corporations on their side of the house, and you aren't able to hold individuals accountable. It's called the veil for a reason, and it's because it unduly separates individuals from consequences, which is not super coherent, considering all a company is on a philosophical level is an amalgamation of a lot of individuals that are all making decisions. That's why say in international law, it's perfectly coherent to try individual Nazi leaders at the Nuremberg trials, even though they were all working on behalf of the Third Reich. Obviously, a corporation is an amalgamation of individuals that are all making conscious decisions that are contributing to a greater harm in this instance. And also, we can still hold the companies accountable. Very unclear why all of LOC presumes that there's a trade-off between holding individuals accountable and the companies accountable. Our advocacy is clear that we can do both. The piercing the veil is like an extra step on top of the holding the corporations accountable. Also, I think you still just maintain moral agency if you're part of a corporation, and therefore you should be liable for justice, even if you're acting on behalf of a larger entity. Op would have you believe that suing the company itself is just as good of a deterrent level, but it fails to consider Emmanuel's PMC push on settlements and the incentives that settlements bring about, because how are you ever going to hope to achieve deterrence or any level of environmental help on their side of the house if you just talk about the fact that settlements are actually good, and I'll get to more on the settlement thing later. And remember, Emmanuel tells us that the worst environmental violations happen at a massive scale: oil rigs, polluting rivers, dumping into egregious amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, etc. This means that on a resource allocation level of the state and of the legal system, pursuing these specific individuals that are liable for these things makes a lot of sense, because on a weighing level, if they are successful and stop the environmental harms, it's a great victory that massively helps the environment. And if they somehow fail and it doesn't add deterrence, it's not a huge amount of extra resources, because as much as Sarah would want to have you believe that it's this egregious burden on the legal system to hold individuals accountable, it's actually not that hard to just tack an individual onto a lawsuit, because they comparatively have less money and less power and less legal defense than the corporation does. So it's very easy to just say, oh, we're going to go after ExxonMobil, and fuck it, the CEO is going down too because he led all those decision making. But then in the newspaper, it has an outsized look because people look, the CEO of Exxon is in jail, or lost all of his money and went bankrupt because he did this, because he let this oil rig or oversaw this oil rig that leaked all this oil into the Gulf of Mexico, or whatever the fuck they did, right? And I think insofar as that's true, there the resource allocation that the legal system is doing towards this process has a comparative greater benefit in the consequences it brings about than it does a downside, even if it fails to work. So it's worth the risk, even if there's a very small risk and a great reward. And crucially, I think this is proactive, because things like high legal fees and fear of prison time or losing all your money and going bankrupt make people think twice before violating environmental regulations. In the status quo that Op defends, you can easily shift company funds into personal funds, and then that oil rig profits are untouchable by the law, despite it essentially being blood money. Especially because in this country, the environmental harms that we do don't just affect our wildlife or our drinking water or our air, they also affect the global south. They also contribute to the broader trend, the systemic trend, as Sarah would have you believe, of global warming across the country, which then will cause things like mass migration and mass death in the long term. And guess what? When there's mass death and mass migration, 50, 100 years down the line, the U.S. is going to be in a lot of hot water, both literally and metaphorically, and it's going to have a much harder time cleaning up that error. So if you want to talk about resource allocation and what's smart to do, I think preventing those things now while we can is good, considering the severity of the crisis. And also, I just think that considering these people are massively harming the global south and causing all these issues in the long term, they deserve to be held accountable on a moral level and deserve to get a consequence for their actions beyond just their company firing them or beyond just their company getting a slap on the wrist. I think the core problem is that the executives are too insulated from real consequences of their actions. Sarah says that the judges just get to throw out the cases. I think this is just non-unique. They can also just throw out the LLC lawsuits happening on your side of the house. It's very unclear why judge discretion is negative in this instance and not in other instances. I think that Op wants us to think that because it's a radical legal theory that judges are now going to suddenly only throw out these things. But insofar as the judge is already supporting a push for environmental justice, they're probably going to support a further push too if the judge is already on the same ideological page with environmental justice. Because in these cases, these people objectively did violate regulations that are on the books. It's not up for debate, right? They say that novel theories will be sent to higher courts. Presumably, this isn't like an illegal thing to do, right? Like violating environmental regulations is against the law and illegal. Piercing the veil is a valid legal strategy. The info slide tells us both of these things. I think it makes perfect sense that you should be able to combine them. So even if it was sent to a higher court, I know the Supreme Court is like sort of an activist court, but I think that like even they have to make like in clear-cut decisions that actually like benefit like what the actual law is. That's why like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who are conservative justices, consistently side with liberals on certain issues because they still are like at the end of the day reading the law and they know they can't justify too much of an egregious reading of the law. And so I think that like this is still probably legal and fine and will be allowed. Then Sarah says settlements are good. This is a really, really, really big problem with their case and the core problem with their case. The thing is, even if settlements bring the government money in the short term, I sue Exxon and I get like a $5 billion settlement. That money actually doesn't do much to help the environment. One, because the money doesn't directly go towards the environment. It's not like every single settlement you get from environmentally bad companies goes directly back into the environment. Two, bureaucracy exists, which makes that money not the most effective at getting pushed back into helping the environment. And three, environmental regulations can change and shift over time. So just because you take $5 billion from Exxon and the government has $5 billion, it doesn't mean that that's going to like cause $5 billion in like carbon offsets or anything. On the counterfactual, what we provide to you is active, proactive deterrence, which means if we take them at their highest ground, even if they're right that settlements are not the most effective, or that settlements bring the government more money, we think that what's better is proactively preventing environmental harm, which happens when the executives and the people that actually make decisions think twice before they violate these environmental regulations. And I think they have a lower delta on actually helping the environment.Hy is helping the environment to make impact in this round? Very obviously, the environment is what is like a prerequisite to life on this planet. And so therefore, whatever saves the environment is like just a scalarly and infinitely more important impact than anything else. Then we hear from Sarah, but climate change is systemic. It's not individual. First of all, the philosophy I gave you at the top of this speech already beat this argument. The system is made up of individuals that are all making decisions that lead to a system, right? If every individual in the system changed their behaviors, the system would no longer do this thing. So I think it's a kind of a cop-out to say, oh, well, it's just like the system, right? Because that kind of thinking is how you never get systemic justice. That same, like, imagine like a police brutality case, if a police officer did something bad to like a racial minority. Oh, well, policing as a system is just broken, so they shouldn't hold that cop accountable. No, obviously it's coherent to both hold individuals and systems accountable and think the system needs broader reform. That's why you do environmental legislation and you hold these individuals accountable. It's perfectly coherent. Second of all, and as we've already proven the deterrence on why these individuals think twice on our side of the house when they're really scared of bankruptcy or going to jail or whatever, and they're insulated on their side. Sarah tells us it's more effective to hold the companies accountable, but gives no reason why we can't also hold the companies accountable too. The info slide is very clear on that. Additionally, even if we keep taking down these CEOs, Sarah would have you believe that like it just is filled back in by a CEO that's bad for the environment. But that wouldn't happen. If you like take down 5 environmentally bad CEOs in a row, they're not just going to put up another environmentally bad CEO because one, no one's going to take the job if they're going to jail or all going bankrupt. Literally, no one will take that job. But second of all, there's positive incentives for companies to be pro-environmental, right? The balance is not, it's great to be negative for the environment and horrible to be good for the environment. No, there's some incentives to be good for the environment. There's like tax write-offs for recycling. There's tax rebates for like electric cars, or things like consumers that are pro-environmentally conscious will buy your products more. So I think that all this is doing is tipping the scales more in favor of being pro-environment, which might be the push the company need to take that jump. Sarah says the company won't have lost any money, but no, we hold both of them accountable. Sarah then says these lawyers are trading in fraud, not environmental regulations. Presumably, we just get environmentally knowledgeable lawyers to work on these cases or advising them. That's a non-issue. They say pro-environment companies will be targeted by this. No, I think one, these companies just win the lawsuits even if they are targeted because there's some prosecutorial discretion and there's some judge discretion that they talk about to not go after like a pro-environment company for violating these things. And also, I don't think empirically that pro-environment companies are really violating these laws on the level that would command lawsuits. They say watchdogs fail. No, watchdogs, even if they don't actually work in practice, are enough of a scary like boogeyman to provide deterrence because people are scared of the presence of them. They said suing the CEO alone is not effective. One CEO is not effective. No, we're going to sue multiple CEOs. We're going to take out the whole fucking board if we have to. No reason why we can't do that. They say the motion doesn't talk about wrongdoing. They do this semantic argument about like when wrongdoing is found, and they said they can just pierce the veil later. No, clearly our advocacy is we support piercing the veil. They don't support piercing the veil. I think that's perfectly coherent. You guys can just go read the motion. I know you understand it. Thus proposed.
I thank that speaker for their speech. Emma, whenever you're ready.
Cool. First, some pleasantries. Sarah, thanks for debating with me. It's been a good tournament. Great debating with you. Second, to our opponents, I've seen both of you debate a couple times. Emmanuel, I don't think I've debated you before, but respect both of you debaters. Happy to be having this round. The judges for taking time out of your day to judge, make this tournament work for everybody, and to all the spectators for coming to support, watch. Hope you get something out of this. The order of the MO is going to be 2 overviews. Actually, I'm gonna answer the very start of the MG and then go to two like offload overviews. Okay. First, this argument about how the SQO is failing. I think we need to identify that the status quo is actually doing pretty substantial stuff. This is why companies aren't violently polluting literally every river around them. Even if it's not the best on the margins, it's still deterring people from committing things. Second, on this thing about how corporations are people, I think this is a fundamental misrepresentation of how corporate incentive structures work. The CEO doesn't make a decision to pollute because they want to pollute or on a whim they decided to pollute. No, companies are at the whim of broader market forces that are in general able to dictate their actions. They themselves tell you this when they tell you, oh, companies are making a rational decision to settle. They're just paying the fee for polluting. This proves that it's not an individual decision, but rather the result of larger macroeconomic factors that make the decisions for them. On to the deterrence debate. First, what do we think that their world looks like? What do lawsuits in their world actually look like? They're going to target individuals who, one, are going to get replaced by people with the same structural incentives. Notably, we think that corporations have a lot of control over who gets prosecuted. Notably, in case background, as these things exist in the status quo, they only target people who commit, quote, fraud. Note that this is a difficult thing to prove in general in legal systems, and importantly, corporations have large discretion over who actually gets convicted for these things like fraud, i.e. if you've been cooking the books, it's easy to point to one of your accountants who just handed the information in big air quotes, which means when these lawsuits pierce the veil, the people that they're likely to be able to pierce are never going to be the type of CEOs that they identify, because the large corporation can always say the CEO didn't know about it, falsify internal documents, etc., all things that people empirically do in the status quo. This is why CEOs never get prosecuted for tax fraud. It's always some random person who gets a slap on the wrist and then gets paid a large departure bonus in order to compensate for them. This beats all of their arguments about deterrence because it means that every single time that one of these lawsuits goes through, the company just gets to, one, choose who takes the punishment, two, pay them an amount greater than the punishment. Specifically, we can see their settlement analysis from the company's perspective. Pollution is also a rational decision. This proves that removing an individual is insufficient. At best, what they do is increase the cost of a lawsuit. But given that all of these things are priced into the size of the settlement, initially, it means that these are never going to happen. But these lawsuits are still going to cost money, so we get fewer good lawsuits that target the corporation. A couple of trade-off warrants. First, we tell you in LOC, and it's conceded out of the MG that all of these institutions are going to be poor. Large companies don't want to sue each other, so we're looking at things like environmental watchdog groups or government organizations that have been gutted from funding for years. The implication of this is that lawsuits are just hard, so every dollar of financial trade-off moves matters a lot. You're suing someone. You have to get prepared to be countersued if you lose the case. You have to spend multiple years and millions of dollars on lawyer fees in order to sue these big companies. This is supercharged by the fact that these are giant companies with massive lawyer teams, which means you have to pay a lot to be able to have the legal abilities to overcome these. We don't think that these institutions have the capital sitting around to do these like year after year spending millions of dollars. But second, it's not just tacking on an additional thing. It's a new burden that you have to clear in a court, i.e. that of fraud. This requires a second trial. And even if it's not an entirely new new trial, it's a new set of gathering evidence and figuring out like what exists, paying lawyers to do discovery. This is hundreds of more hours of legal pay. Given that lawyers get paid like $5,000 an hour, this is like literally $5 billion extra dollars that this costs your institution. What does this actually look like? It looks like on their side, they get, one, a comparatively large number of lawsuits of the second kind from background that don't hold the whole company accountable and instead go straight towards piercing the veil because people are likely to target these things. But two, even if they're right that you can't just do both, it's more expensive to do both than to just do one. I think this is a pretty intuitive argument. So if we're winning that the thing that they add on at extra cost is fundamentally ineffective compared to ours, it's enough for us to win this argument. Why is it the case that targeting corporations is able to create this sort of structural deterrence? First, it's guaranteed to hit every stockholder in the market, i.e., rather than targeting specific ones that are going to be eligible for fraud or something like this, it means that every stockholder is hit by the value lost to the company, i.e. if the company loses $1 million, that's $1 million of stockholder value. And yes, it's distributed, but we think that these punishments are likely to be large. I'll do that later. Second, it just straight up impacts the company value. Punishments will be comparatively larger when you target the corporation as opposed to an individual. A bunch of reasons. One, an individual has less personal value in as much as the amount of money that you have is a standard used to establish deterrent punishments, because obviously you need to punish someone with more money more in order to create the same sense of deterrence. As soon as a corporation has lots and lots of capital and value that they could be punished for, you're going to be able to punish them more than even if an individual has $1 million. Exxon has $1 billion, so you're going to be able to do that. Second, people have more sympathy for individuals than they have for countries. This means the jury that awards the settlement is going to see an actual person that they have to tell in their face that they're about to lose $10 million, as opposed to the abstract notion of corporation. Juries are much more willing to punish. Third, if we win this argument, why does this matter? First, it turns all of their deterrence arguments out of PMC because it proves that on our side, we get more access to these sort of deterrent effects against corporations doing these things. And two, If we're right that the punishments are larger on our side of the house, it means you have more funding for other lawsuits. Even if these things are just settlements, it means that the settlements are likely to be larger because people do risk analysis and there's a higher chance of getting a higher amount of money, so the settlements will be larger too. This means that these small environmental groups get access to more money and more ability to fund these two things. Fourth, I'll answer this vague notion about having two pots of money here. Proving fraud is hard and thus expensive. I do that above. Next MG answer to this is about the jail time thing. First, the personal bail is just about financial losses per background. Personal assets is the word straight out of background. But second, obviously crimes are still illegal and jailable. Like if you do embezzlement and that has jail time, you're going to go to jail on both sides of the house. But second, these are white collar crimes. So even if there's right that there's jail time, these things are likely to be short. I.e. white collar criminals are the people who write the laws or know people directly who write the laws or are on the books of the people who write the laws through things like lobbying. This means these punishments are likely to be overwhelmingly small. In our best case, this means that the fines are just going to be small numbers, like 50,000 to 100,000, which means all of these people don't want to be the scapegoat arguments that the PMR might try to pull through. But it also means that you can just find some lower level person who's willing to accept $200,000 to go to jail for 3 months, which isn't large enough to deter even in their best case. Next argument they make is about the ability to shift profits into private accounts to dodge things that don't pierce the veil. One, this is just illegal. That's fraud, and you go to jail for it if you transfer public accounts or you transfer your company's public money into your private account, which is its own crime, which you can go to jail for. But second, and more importantly, even if we're wrong about that, these were originally company profits. They're on the book as profits, so they can still be reclaimed, which means even if you transfer them out, the company will be put into debt, and then you'll have to pay it out of your private account anyways, because nobody at the corporate structure wants an individual to be able to literally take all of this money out of it. Lastly, there's this blippy thing in the round about how you'll be able to change corporate culture with these sorts of lawsuits. This is nonsensical because one, these lawsuits are going to be very few and far between, i.e. getting one person or even in their best case, 10 people removed from a massive corporation every 3 years is such a small percentage of the types of people that are going to exist, especially given if we're winning all these arguments about people actively circumventing it, there's no way you're just going to cherry pick the people that leave. Corporate culture will stay intact. And it's just one more list of things that it costs them to do crime. On the weighing, I think they actually do this weighing for us. All the stuff about how climate change is bad and the principle means that this is a winning argument. Second, I think that the MG, or second overview, I think that the MG does a really, really bad job responding to a bunch of our innovation stuff. We can concede the PMC's analysis that frivolous lawsuits are primarily going to be used against small companies. They're going to get weaponized and used to kill all of these starting businesses. The implication of this argument is straightforward. Big coal really doesn't want any small environmental companies to open up. Thus, they will shoot them down with a ton of frivolous lawsuits, even if they're losing money in the process, because they need to maintain their market share in the mean term. The implication of this argument is straightforward. It means that any company that's trying to develop environmental technology that competes with these mega corporations, big gas, big oil, etc., are never going to be able to get off the ground because they get targeted by all of these things. The only answer that we get in the MG, and thus the only thing the PMR can go for, is they'll win the lawsuits. Two answers. One, they literally won't win the lawsuit because they're going to get out-lawyered to death. Being a lawyer is a technical skill that requires expertise, which means having more time, money, resources, ability to pay better lawyers means that you're going to win these lawsuits. Two, they don't have to win the lawsuits to trigger this impact because the point of frivolous lawsuits is that you lose them. You force the other company to spend $1 million. Even if you have to spend $10 million, they lose that $1 million. You do this 10 times a year because you're Exxon and have access to hundreds of billions of dollars of capital to make sure that you maintain your market share, and suddenly these aren't going to happen. Proud to oppose.
I think that's speaker for this speech. Call on LOR whenever you're ready.
Last little bit of pleasantries because I missed my first time round. To thank the spectators. Thank you, Feifei, Aiden, Sam. It means a lot that you're here. Okay. Where did my document go? Okay, cool. My time will go ahead and start now. At the top, let's talk about the can do it both argument. First, as Daniel articulately puts, there is a resource trade-off. The argument is mishandled by the MG is that you need a new lawyer. Now, what they don't understand is that the push about this argument is not that you can't get this new lawyer trained. The argument is that it takes time and resources to do so. Working with a new type of lawsuit, i.e. piercing the veil, is more than just writing a line. You need to hire the lawyer who can write that line. This means that there is necessarily a trade-off between the quality of your lawsuit and the amount of lawsuits you can bring. This is also the case for all of their arguments. They tell you about how they want to spend more, they want to like target everyone. They get out of scapegoating by targeting the entire board. All of these cost infinitely more money, and you are always going to be resource disadvantaged, as has been conceded. What is the implication of this for the round? The implication is that they cannot simultaneously claim to do deterrence well and do deterrence on a wide scale, because these companies, these like environmental regulators fundamentally lack the resources to do so. In SQO, settlements are happening. This is what Daniel tells you. They might have a limited impact, but they are nonetheless having an impact. This is because the companies are not companies have put aside this money. This means that it is inevitably going to be the case that we are winning some of these lawsuits, and we are winning many of them. What happens is you can weigh on probability and magnitude here. Once you introduce the new legal attempt to pierce the veil, it becomes the case that you can pursue less cases, therefore less companies are getting targeted and changing their ways, even if you buy their deterrence. But also, you can weigh on probability here, because we don't know that those lawsuits are going to succeed, which means we are trading a system that is effective, yes, marginally, for a system that targets less companies and has less of a chance of succeeding. I personally prefer the one where we are finally getting ground on climate change in SQO. Also, on the theory of the motion, Daniel doesn't extend this, but I'll just reiterate what I said in the PMC, which is that I think I encourage everyone to read the motion. The use of the word alleged is important here. I think it is very possible on our side of the house to also do it later. Okay. I think we're ahead on deterrence. Daniel did it better, but two specific lines of argumentation I want to pull through. One, companies do budget for lawsuits in SQO for settlements. This means that they are financially hindered, even if marginally. This is to the point of deterrence working in SQO. Recognize then that a gov ballot is not some like last-ditch risk of offense Hail Mary that, as the PMR might try to claim, but rather we are throwing away a system that works, guaranteed, for a system that has a low probability of happening. The second line of defense I want to pull through is this argument about scapegoating that I think just isn't responded to. Recognize that all of their argumentation only works if the people at the very top of the system are held accountable. Daniel tells you that this is never going to happen. The response of we'll just sue more people is ineffective, because they can always find someone lower down with less resources to fight the lawsuit, which means that you will never actually target the people in charge because they are protected by an army of lawyers. But even if you believe they are marginally ahead on deterrence, why do we still win the round? Counter lawsuits and innovation. I'm going to weigh this most heavily. I think this is the most important impact in the round. We're winning it pretty cleanly. Given that OP has conceded there's a financial barrier to doing these lawsuits, it is comparatively way more likely that these lawsuits of piercing the veil are going to be done by big companies against smaller companies. If you buy all of their warrants about deterrence, then we believe that these smaller companies are going to be far more victimized. Why do we care about this? Let's do the weighing on the innovation ballot. Why is innovation of new tech the most important issue in this round? First, you can weigh this on reversibility. Tech gives us the ability to reverse existing harms, carbon negative technology, whereas on their side of the house, they don't actually have the capacity to undo harms. They just have maybe a chance of preventing them from getting worse. But second, it's the only way to change higher level corporate incentive structures, i.e., if we want to change incentives, what we care about is changing the market for long-term solvency, switching people out of the oil industry into clean tech. They are responsive to market factors, so cheap environmental technology is the only way to make sure that we stop pollution and emitting carbon in the long run, whereas they keep playing whack-a-mole with individuals who step up. We enable these companies that are getting off the ground in SQO to actually have a chance. Finally, about less settlements. Gov concedes this when they say that settlements are accounted for. This means we can weigh on probability, as I described before, but I also think the settlements are exogenous good because they allow us to have the money to continue fighting these lawsuits for long-term solvency. Proud to oppose.
Okay, thank you. PMR, whenever you're ready.
Emmanuel, do you see the last thing I texted you?
Yeah, I think we're on the same page again. I was thinking that too.
Lovely.
Yeah. One sec. Jonas is cooking in my house.
I'm sure.
You're sure? Yeah. You're not going to starve? Okay. Let me pull out my timer. three independent ways we get solvency, because their case is people are going to be too poor to do this. And if I prove that people are wealthy enough to do this, ostensibly find the right lawyers. And even if the lawyers are imperfect to win, at least they raise the cost of the company doing business, winning the lawsuit, and therefore still do deterrence. But also they ignore the argument that when it's the case that the CEO is individually tried, that CEO doesn't have a ton of legal defense. That CEO doesn't have a ton of money. And so even if it's the case that the EPA has been gutted, its smaller budget is still bigger than the CEO's. Three independent mechanisms where we get success. Firstly, perhaps the EPA is gutted right now. Well, I guess Biden's president, but fine. Perhaps it's gutted right now. No reason it will always be in the future. No reason why you wouldn't be able to try and deter in those cases. Second, let's say they're right that California is the only state that's able to litigate these cases. No reason that California is poor, right? The argumentation we give you is that agencies, when they have the capital and the incentive to protect the environment, perhaps it's their mandate or perhaps it's because their voters want to protect the environment, those are the instances in which they try. And here's where it's really important. If I want to try a lawsuit and I know it's more expensive to prosecute the CEO and less expensive to prosecute the company, those are the instances in which I'll choose to prosecute.
Point of order.
What's up?
The specific line about how even if the EPA is gutted, places like California have money, this is a new response to the LOC line that environmental regulators have no funding.
Sweet. I'll leave it up for consideration.
Yeah, we'll take it into consideration.
Cool. What should exist the future? What was I saying last? Incentives. Oh, yes. Corporations.
More expensive to prosecute.
Yeah. When it's more expensive, then they'll do that. And the inverse. Okay, cool. And then, the preempt that we kind of gave you from the start of PMC, if I see that these lawsuits against the CEOs are all failing, then I'm not going to do it, right? Like if the last three lawsuits all got nothing, and I want money per their case, and I get more money per their case, I'm not going to do the Gov's case. So we said that because people aren't stupid and they're thinking about how to win, they choose the instances that suit their specific victory conditions. And this is terrible for a corporation because when they're planning how to fuck over the planet next, they're not sure under which grounds they're going to be punished. And therefore, deterrence is a far higher scale. They have more, exposure, for example, to be punished. The only other mechanism is if you give us our least charitable case, right? The argument Alex gives you quite simply is that when watchdogs begin to investigate the CEO for fucking over the planet, that is still sufficient to change the CEO's incentives. And why is this the case? Because when I'm a CEO, at least I know I might be thrown in prison. At least I know there might be a lawsuit. And even if it's the case I think I'll win the lawsuit, I still know I'm still caught in a scandal. And perhaps the corporation just fires me preemptively. I don't know. But basically, it's not good to be investigated. And even if the probability is high that you will win, it is not a certain probability. So why is this important? The CEO then has incentives to behave well. How did we say they would do this? We said, for example, one, they can send around auditors to make sure that middle-level managers do fewer stupid things to reduce the probability that the CEO is going to go to jail. Second, we said that you can promote people within the company who are most likely to advance comparatively more environmental incentives. Alex gives you a devastating argument, which is that there are a wide variety of options that corporations can take that help their bottom line, but also don't hurt the environment. And so in these instances, when I, as the CEO, know that I might individually be punished, I kind of tell people like, hey, let's not do the stupid anti-environmental thing. Like, let's just do that because it's easy. The issue is that on their side of the house, there's a smaller incentive for this change to happen. Also, why are they incentivized to do this, even if it's the case that only a few of these lawsuits win? Firstly, we expressed that jail is like very, very bad for people. It's very, very scary. And second, the assets argument. Alex's argument was a lot smarter than what Emo gave him credit for, which is that it's not that you're transferring money into your account secretly, and therefore, because it's secret, you would just try that under fraud. The argument we give you is that in the status quo, CEOs and executives don't care about doing bad things to the planet because even if the shareholders are worse off by the CEO hurting the planet, it's the fact that the CEO already has a fat bank account that they don't care about that anymore. So Alex controversially said that you have to take away that fat bank account to actually change their incentives. Cool. Couple more pieces.
Order. Sorry. I know
What?
you're saying this is a re-articulation of the MG argument. The exact line from MG is you take money from the corporate account to your personal funds. I think your re-articulation is a new warrant.
Okay, cool. I might be wrong, but I'll leave it up.
The MG argument is pretty clearly that executives of companies are insulated from consequence because once the money is their money, it cannot be targeted by these laws. That's just like the info slide. That's just kind of like stating the case. So
I think there is a line between, yes, I agree it's been in the round so far that the personal funds are insulated. The link between the money going from from corporate to personal is what is, I think, different than what Emmanuel just said. Am I explaining this adequately?
Yes, but I just trust that the judges will be able to evaluate, like if it's new.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So that, yeah. But yeah, you're saying it very well. Cool. Is anyone not ready?
No, continue.
Cool. Here's where I want to point out that unfortunately for UP, a lot of their cases incredibly defensive. So let's say they're right that the old CEO that's kicked out is replaced by someone who also does something bad. Well, they're doing something bad regardless. So I guess that wouldn't matter. It's the fact that you are likely, instead of that, to pick someone who is like not going to be just as bad. And it's all of the mechanisms I provided to you before for why that person's incentives probably do change. But secondly, when they're like, this isn't going to work because corporations always lose. So like they're piercing the veil for fraud. Like I don't know. Like this seems strange that like punishing someone directly never directly changes their incentives. Let's weigh against their shareholders argument because I think it's interesting. The shareholders will financially be worse off, and therefore they will force the board to behave effectively. First, they already beat their own argument by expressing that the cost to the shareholder is diffused. Let's say that there's a $5 billion settlement across 200,000 shareholders. Like do the math, very low cost. Second, they never give a warrant for how shareholders actually force the board to change their incentives, right? Like they never actually express how shareholders then translate into good decisions on the part of the company. Ostensibly, the way they would do that is by asking the CEO to do pro-environmental regulation. So we say that if the shareholders can ask or that you can be thrown in prison, perhaps being thrown in prison is a stronger motivator. And even if that's not the case, we express that shareholders have already priced into the cost of their investment in the shares, the price of doing business. And so they know that the cost of their shares is incredibly low. Weighing against their argument that you'll be lawyered, we explained that you can still sue this poor corporation on both sides of the house for environmental damages. So this isn't unique. But secondly, we think that pro-environmental companies are far more likely to be well capitalized. Like it requires a huge amount of fixed expense, for example, to do these sorts of things. So I think it's likely to be large. But deterrence also outweighs. Proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech. That marks the end of the debate. So everyone except the panel can go back to the general
sorry.
room. Oh,
Can I point of order the end of that speech? Maybe I just missed this in MG, but I think the argument that scapegoating the frivolous lawsuits are going to occur on both sides of the house was not an MG.
That was an MG, but they can just look at the flow and take it.
Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Yes, you can return to the general room. I think we're doing announcements there. Yeah. Okay, cool. I think what we can do is take like 2 to 3 minutes to look over your notes and come up with an initial call. Then we can go through each person. Just like, I mean, if we all agree, then this will be a much faster discussion than if we don't. So yeah. Okay. It's been around 2 minutes. Do people have an initial call? Yeah. Enough?
Yeah, me too.
Okay, then let's start with Umesh. Can you just do the call and like a 30-second explanation of why you gave it that way?
I have Gov. I think the reason for most of it is I'm at the end of the day just unsure what additive harm that op is like proposing. So I think the motion, the way it states, means that you can like do it smartly. You can do it after, in which most instances it happens. I think a lot of op analysis for why you just start doing this is analysis for why this succeeds, in which case it's good, or the other analysis that you go back in previous works, which is mitigatory at best. The monopoly stuff is cool. It's terminalized very weakly. So it's not terminalized as monopoly argument. It's terminalized as a whole company suing climate change, which is very uncomparative. So I don't think it's enough to outweigh Gov. This was my
Okay. Pranav?
Yeah, I agree. Op is largely defensive. All their offense is taken out by the top of PMR, which is we can do it smartly. Their other layer of offense that like I think is somewhat there is like the big companies to the small companies, like Omesh said. I do think the impact is a little more than what Omesh did. I just don't think it's like weighed. Um, like yeah, maybe small companies stop doing innovation, but I think they could have terminalized the innovation much better to saying like this is the necessary step to being the solving thing in climate change and like whatnot. But they didn't do that, and insofar as they never beat the climate change weighing, they just concede it. This is not like a voting issue in the round.
Okay, cool. This is great because I also voted Gov. This will make life much easier. I think it is important though to go through some of the biggest, like most tightly contested things, I think, and ensure that we're kind of all on the same page, just for the sake of like making sure we didn't miss anything. So I think the biggest contested issue was on the affordability or the feasibility of piercing the corporate veil and whether or not we think it is likely that Gov will have the funds or the capability to actually pursue these kinds of lawsuits and succeed in a reasonable number of cases. So, I mean, obviously, OP has a lot of response on this, suggesting that it's too expensive and you wouldn't be able to do any of it. But generally, what were your thoughts on like why you think OP's analysis wasn't good enough to deal with it? I guess we can start. Yeah, Umesh.
so first thing, I think like Gov is at least able to prove that you do it after you win. That's literally in the motion in many instances. So I just don't know what the harm is, even if it's expensive. You already won a lawsuit, you have some money, like you can choose to do or not to do it. So I'm not sure like why that precludes the first part in that essence. Like the trade-off is happening after in those instances. And if you go for the second version, which is, oh, people don't do the first lawsuit, but do the second lawsuit, that knifes their first part of the case. So I just don't know like which impact to believe. My head just ends up going like just go with the first version, which is like what the motion state happens in most instances.
Okay. Pranav?
Mostly agree with Omesh. Um, I just think the interpretation at the top of the PMR makes it like difficult. I don't think they really get around the MG. Like you can do both or one.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think broadly the main thing that I was like questioning was they don't really have enough proof to explain why targeting the CEO is certainly what people are going to do. As in, I think Gov does enough to explain why these companies, like if you do have to make the trade-off, they'll probably be reasonable in that in cases where they think it is more important to sue the company or more likely to succeed in suing the company, then they'll sue the company. And if you think it's better to sue the CEO, then you'll sue the CEO. I just don't see why there's an overwhelming likelihood that you're definitely going to sue only the individual on opposition side, at least from my perspective.
Just
Uh,
one quick thing to
yes.
add there. I think if you're also like if you're suing the second case, which is you're suing the CEO or individual members, that means there's some efficacy. That's why they're doing it rather than doing the first one.
Mhm.
So that's an advantage that goes to Gov's case, right? So that knifes the first part that this is like not needed. Like
Okay.
it's probably working. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think the second thing was on like the deterrence effect and just largely which one is greater. I mean, I think broadly, like both sides have reasonable things to say, like why in the lawsuit themselves, like there may be ways in which they can win or lose. But on deterrence, I generally thought that, especially since like context-wise, the likely case, it is the first case in the intro side that when the company has insufficient funds to provide the required or requested compensation, then you break the corporate veil and turn to the individual. I think in many of those cases, there is a like significant difference in terms of deterrence because the individual knows now that it's not only that they have to pay, but also just as a whole, the company and the CEO would generally have to pay more than what they would actually like be able to settle for on opposition side or something like that. Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. I mean, I think this was pretty clear. I guess the last thing on smaller companies and larger companies, yeah, I think I largely agreed with both of you. I think it has some impact, but it's just not weight enough. I do think it's a little unclear how this would work. I mean, I could be wrong, but I was under the impression that the vast majority of these lawsuits are either by like class action, like individuals who are harmed by environmental damage from like a certain region or something like that, or it's more likely to be like bureaucratic. So the government themselves and those officials investigate. I think it's not very likely that it's a company suing another company. I don't know. To me, this context just seemed very, very weird. I don't know if this is like
I think it's one of those low scope, high magnitude things where like
okay.
it probably doesn't happen that much, but like let's say Exxon tried to buy out some company because they wanted to do patent protection and stuff, and this company is like not accepting any deal, then they'll sue the company. But it's like very, very rare. But I think the best version of the op is that these rare instances are the ones in which these companies are the biggest threat and thus need to be the most protected.
I think
Okay.
I think the better version is the LOC version that's not pulled through, which is a blip, which is basically that you need a lot more lawyers. Bigger companies have a lot more lawyers. Smaller companies don't have the lawyer. So when an external one is suing you, like small companies are not able to protect yourself. Bigger companies are. And I
I
think
just
like
doubt
that,
that.
yeah, I think it's not terminalized. And I like there is a line of argumentation there on distortionary market forces, on like, yeah, like just creating monopolies. But I just don't think that version is pulled through. And the version they go for is like bigger coal companies do this.
Wait,
But that's
I think even if the third party is suing the smaller companies, the only way this matters if the smaller company is like an environmentally good company. So like if this company is like making
yeah,
like if this company is making clean batteries, but they like over like do something with steel, I don't think the nonprofit is going to sue them anyways. Like I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it would, yeah, I think it would be stronger for the argument if that was the case, but I don't think that's true.
I think there's a
Yeah.
whole economic scope of the debate that didn't happen on op,
Yeah.
which is like fuck the environment, econ, like yeah, monopolies. But yeah, I agree.
Okay. All right. Well, it seems like we mostly agree on everything. I think that's largely good then. We just go back to the general room, right? To announce. Okay, cool.
Wait, do we
Well,
not give RFD and bring the
Oh
call
yeah,
back into RFD?
oh,
yeah, we do.
wait, are we? Oh, wait, I thought the
Wait,
CAs agreed we're not. Or
no,
are we?
we ended up agreeing that we are doing it. I tried
Oh,
to not
okay.
do. Also, quick question. Apparently we also recorded the OA. Do you guys want to like cut that out? Do you guys want to like put that in? Might be cool. Yeah, I'll leave it up to your discretion. I'll edit it out if you guys don't want to.
I'm fine with it.
I don't have a preference. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll keep this in the recording.
I think
Okay.
delibs are good to keep.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you can
Then
you can call the I can go and call them back, but I have the
okay.
recording on actually.
Cool.
Pranav, can you go? Because I have the recording on, and then we'll start recording the general room.
Wait, why don't you stop the recording? Well, I'll go. But
Yeah. No, because then I also now record the RF. Okay.
Wait, are they coming here?
Yeah, because
Okay.
there's two delibs, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, APDA is weird. That's what I was chatting, that we can just skip the delibs in terms of doing it fast. But like I think APDA has a norm of doing like RFTs for each round.